All right, welcome back for another episode of the Unplanned Show, where we talk about disruption, what's causing it, technical changes, team and people challenges, and how to deal with it. And so today I'm excited to have Ashley Ward from Orca Security. Say hello, Ashley.
Why, hello, Ashley.
um, and so we're going to be talking a little bit about that security angle in all of this kind of the disruption and unplanned work and how do you grapple with it, particularly in sort of the cloud era that we're in. Before we get into that, just want to quickly cover a couple of the other episodes we have coming up. Next week, we'll be back with Charity Majors of Honeycomb and James Governor of Red Monk. We'll be talking about LLM observability, sort of picking up on a conversation that actually started on a Honeycomb webinar maybe a month ago. And then after that, we're going to have Jamie Vernon on talking about a culture of automation, picking up on a great talk that he gave about a year and a half ago that we are just due for an update on. And then looking out a little bit further ahead, we also have Jeff Cessna scheduled to talk to us a little bit about platform engineering. He had a great comment on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago about basically if your platform engineering team is working off of ticket queues, they're not really a platform engineering team. And so I wanted to pick his brain about that opinion. I do want to call out also on the housekeeping front that the audio versions of these episodes, the Unplanned Show, are now available on both Spotify and Apple iTunes, the podcast place in Apple. I'll go ahead and post the link here for folks to be able to find that on your kind of two main places where you listen to your audio podcast. So we've caught up to the first 4 episodes. We'll be getting those edited and posted for your listening only pleasure if you don't like to tune in to the live stream videos that we're doing every Monday. So with that, let's go ahead and get into it. So Ashley, you and I were catching up a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that really stuck with me when we kind of also talked about like, hey, Orca security and PagerDuty, why has that been something that's a thing for folks? And you brought up something that really stuck with me that made a lot of sense and connects to that whole thing you hear that's sort of the public service, public safety announcements of like security is everyone's job. And which is like, yes. And what does that mean exactly? And you had some really great points about how needing to mobilize not just the security team is actually really important. And I wanted to dig in to understand a little bit of like, where is that coming from? Because you had a couple of interesting tidbits around that. But this seems like a great place to unpack a little bit more about what does it mean for security to be everyone's job in the cloud era?
Well, I think when everybody says that it's everybody's job, that means it's everyone's fault. So we know that it's everyone's to blame, apart from perhaps the security team. I'm from an operations background, so for me, it was always about how to make things work in an organization, as opposed to necessarily following some sort of policy that was there. It was like, well, real life dictates what we do. Security for everybody, it really means that it's everybody but security who are the ones who are going to fix whatever the problems are. So this is where I've always felt there's an affinity with PagerDuty, but it's about getting the information to the right eyes, who are the people who can solve the problem. So we tend to always put it the other way around, where it's like the blame shall go to the person who did it. And it's like, no, instead, let's try and democratize it. Let's try and go, well, security as a function aren't going to fix everything. Everybody else is going to fix it. But we need to be able to engage everyone and say, okay, well, here's actionable information that you can use to fix this problem, as opposed to after the fact going, thou shalt not. That's always a thing for everybody's security is everybody's issue, because it should be everyone's actually the solution rather than the problem.
Okay. And actually, I realized I jumped straight into things and I forgot to ask kind of just an important question. Sometimes I ask about coffee or tea. I'm going to back out and then I'm going to come right back in while I'm just letting some of those comments marinate a little bit. But I asked sometimes about coffee versus tea. But Ashley, given that you're Scottish, correct?
I am.
Okay. And I did have the pleasure of spending a year in Scotland. And so I'll ask, maybe it's a softball question, but whiskeys, single malt, or blended, like.
Oh, that's yeah. So they both have a place in the lexicon of drinks. He says with his political hat on. So as a Scotsman, I'm supposed to go single malt, only single malt,
Mhm.
and never touch anything else. Actually, I had some good fun with a place called, and it's not a plug. I'm not a member anymore, so it's not nothing like that. But the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and they took it a step further. They would actually say from one cask. So even
Oh,
like even a single malt is from a single distillery, but you could have like an 18-year-old mixed with a 12-year-old. They could still be mixed in one from one distillery, but they take it a step further. They go, no, it's one cask, and that cask is what makes up the bottle. So ultimately, though, I'm pretty sure the whole of the drinks industry in Scotland will thank you if you just drink more whiskey. That's maybe the better answer there.
well, I think we can actually connect this back to our primary topic, because that idea of, hey, are you going to really have this, um, the knowledge to distinguish between, not only your blended, but all this whole universe of single malts, which, that starts to become its own, um, area. Lots to sort of unpack there. Takes a lot of knowledge and maybe some skills. And then you start to get down to like, oh no, it's not just that. You go single, that you go to like this cask. It starts to feel a little bit like that kind of deep expertise, where it starts to kind of, a lot of people feel, okay,
Are we back? Are we
I think we're
back?
back.
Okay, all right. I was a bit worried about that there.
Sorry.
I'm sorry if I
Okay.
dropped there. I'm sorry.
I think it might have been on my end, because I lost everything.
I was
Um,
searching Google there and it seemed to be working, so I'm not going to blame the hotel Wi-Fi just yet.
um, well, I was in the middle. I was making just a really brilliant breakthrough connection
You
between single
you
malt,
were
single cask, and the
and more.
depth of knowledge of security that excludes people.
Well, and actually, to take a step further, not to push an analogy too far, but in the world of whiskey in Scotland, of course, we think Scotch is the one and only true whiskey, and people from Ireland will argue differently, and in fact, bourbon fans will also argue differently there. But the rules are different. So in Scotland, we're allowed to put some caramelized sugar to do some browning. And in bourbon, you don't. But you are allowed to put staves of wood into the cask to enhance the wood effect. Now, the reason why I bring that up is to your point that even getting to the same end result, which might be a new, more secure world, we might have different approaches to it and different levels of knowledge and agreement on what is right or okay to do. So I think you are onto
Mm.
something there. I think that, and also at some level, I'm pretty sure I can talk for my wife here, that at some level she goes, you're just talking nonsense now, Ashley. It's just whiskey at the end of the day and it tastes awful. So, there are different things to different people. And if it comes to cybersecurity, then yeah, I suppose some people will think whiskey is a magical, the water of life, as it comes from Uskava. But other people go, no, it's just a horrible tasting spirit. Then why would you want to take it?
So, yeah, I think like, if we think about what does that look like in organizations when folks are feeling really out of their depth, like they just don't know everything there is to know about whiskey, and it's like, hey, it's just whiskey, like it's just security, just tell me what I'm supposed to do. How does that manifest an organization with expertise and skills and knowledge gaps?
Usually bluffing, I think, is actually the real way that manifests. But no, it's nobody knows everything about it anyway. So, and I think this is a huge thing, that once you're comfortable in IT, and it does take a little while because we're expected to be experts in things. And if you look at IT as a back office function, certainly over the last 20 years or however long, you can see that it's grown immensely. I mean, now somebody in IT is supposed to know how to operate Git from a version control system. They need to know the specifics of how to use Git history and Git blame and all the different Git commands. They're also supposed to know how to architect and make sure that their cloud services are running properly and that they're not misconfigured. And they're also supposed to be able to respond appropriately to downtime and to fix things, and performance issues and degradation across storage, networking, all these things. And it's impossible. Nobody is going to be able to be the expert on all of these things, or if they are, then they are one extremely talented individual. So instead, I think a lot of it is accepting that nobody's going to be an expert in all these things. And also coming back to the point at the beginning, we shouldn't be looking at this as a blame game. So although we want to, if we take a step back from cloud security, to say we don't want people clicking on those phishing emails. We don't want them clicking on the link. No, but nobody's clicking on the link because they're just excited to see if they're being phished. They're not. It's not a deliberate act that people are doing. They're making a mistake, and we want to try and train people around that or put protection in to stop them making a mistake. And I think a lot of that also comes back from a cloud security point of view. So people want to develop and produce things that make the organization better.
How do organizations kind of manage that with the speed at which they need to be able to respond and deal with security, but also, the complexity and the psychological safety that goes along with, hey, I don't want to get blamed for something. How do we make it safe for people to speak up, but also get moving quickly on resolving something?
So I think that's about trying to embed security as early on as possible in a process, and to make it something that you by default do, as opposed to something you do after the fact. So people talk about secure by design, or they talk about shift left. I mean, even putting any of the buzzwords aside, just making it so that when someone is doing something, they are automatically steered to the more secure option and the more secure choice. And that might be in a small organization just through communication. That might be whoever's running security speaking with those people who are developing solutions. Or in a larger organization, that might mean guardrails, that might mean feedback loops, that might mean going into what happens when they have releases and how that gets alerted back to the people responsible. Communication's key, though. Remember, as much as I'm, my day job is for a security vendor, so I'm very much on technology side of things. Really, it's people and process that any organization needs to focus on. We'll find a way to get the technology to work, but it's people and process. So how do you enable people and how do you automate those processes?
So what have you seen work and be effective for folks who figure out how do they enable people and automate processes? What seems to work? Where do they get started?
They get started with automating whatever they're doing day to day. Now, it's a very vague answer, that one, because we could be talking about any size of organization and any number of different things. But if people are doing things day to day, whatever they're doing that could introduce a security flaw or an opportunity or for a defect or an issue, that's where we want to be able to provide that guidance for people. Now, in the land of, if you're developing software, that might be within a developer's IDE, having a nice little red squiggle that says, you sure you want to do this? And where's Clippy when you need Clippy? But something like that, where we're saying, hey, is this really what you want to do? Or perhaps it's in any form of automation. So if we're automating code quality tests, or we're automating unit testing, or we're automating anything there, can we drop in a security test at that point? And perfect isn't ever going to happen. So start small and iterate, the same as people do on continuous improvement. So start small and iterate on that. If the first thing is you're building containers or Linux Docker containers, or you're building images, let's scan them for misconfigurations or for vulnerabilities. It's small steps that add up over time.
Yeah.
And then I was only going to say, and then but some people find that their security teams are so focused on the right hand side or what's in production, that they find it very difficult to go back into that other side to do that part there. In which case, then automate getting those alerts that concern your security teams in production to the right eyes and to the right people to know about it.
Yeah, this is something I've sometimes referred to as like the potential for that double tax, where you've got to, like, the security team might be involved, and you need, say, the development team to go do something. And even if you've done everything you described in that sort of shift left, like, add the squiggles, just include the, the scanning right in the pre-production pipelines. But sometimes things are uncovered later and there was no way to catch it beforehand. You've got to have a response mechanism. Then you're going to pay a little bit of the double tax when you interrupt your development teams, because however long it takes for them to deal with it, you're exposed. But however, like, the time it takes for them, that they're like, oh, now I have to stop working on whatever I was building, and now I have to go and rebuild my container image with a patched or an updated operating system, or part of my middleware or something. You're both, you've got to figure out, how do you minimize that sort of tax overhead that you spend on either having a really big exposure window if you're trying to protect your developers, but then also the fact that, yeah, if your developers are interrupted but they're not given context and they don't know what to focus on, or they're interrupted unnecessarily, that's going to cost in terms of the innovation velocity that they're going to have, right? All those interruptions. So how do you kind of strike that balance? Just curious, like, what are your thoughts there in terms of, both the prioritization as well as, like, how do you sort of deal with urgency in terms of, like, hey, we don't want to interrupt everybody all the time, but how do we know when it's the right time?
It's going to come down to that capacity for change and capacity for risk, and what an organisation is happy with. Now, the first thing I'd say is that you've got to remember, and I say this a lot to especially dyed-in-the-wool operations people, or people from security who remember ye olde days. But ye olde days where we would just say everything gets patched in production, full stop, that's it, done. But the actual tax cost then on the business was so high that we wanted to have this way of rolling out things a lot quicker and a lot smoother. So it was small changes more frequently. I certainly remember patching production environments and then having the next release from development fail because actually the environment was so different. And so you've passed that critical security alert has passed, and therefore we're not at risk from a security point of view, but we have still impacted the business further down the line. So you do need to look at the bigger picture and say, what are we trying to achieve? And that's going to be different if you're running a nuclear power station versus hosting cat pictures. It is going to be, what your capacity for that risk is. But the big thing is to go, right, okay, what's the happy medium? If it's a critical, exploitable, actionable alert, then we want to do something about that. If it's critical, but actually it's not publicly exposed, nobody's using that service, and it's, the risk is mitigated, then we don't need to patch it as fast. So what I would say is that the context, as you've mentioned, is king in this situation. We need to have something that's going to be actionable. So we're telling people, here's how you can fix this, rather than just go fix this. And we need to say, this is the context around that. So you need to fix this, or we really want you to fix this because it's a publicly exposed asset, it's an exploitable vulnerability, and that has a direct lead to our crown jewels of healthcare information, credit cards, something that the business feels is critical. So having that ability to go, it's not security just saying, patch it all now, please, because we've got a vulnerability. It's instead saying, no, this is critical, and it's exploitable, and it leads to something bad happening. That then means that actually what we have is, you wouldn't necessarily treat it as any other bug in software, but you can treat it as that this is a critical defect that we need to deal with, as opposed to their security just telling us to patch everything again.
And what are some of the pieces of, I mean, you mentioned kind of high level qualitative, hey, publicly, accessible or exposed, and exploitable. Are there ways to sort of automate how you kind of bring in like, and here's how you should remediate it, right? So it's just, I am not going to like as much as that context, I guess. Are there ways to kind of automate that so that it's pretty straightforward for someone and then it's easy for them to take that responsibility because they know I'm gonna be pretty well supported when I've got to go do something. Like I'm gonna know what I'm supposed to do, and I'm not gonna be on a wild goose chase to figure out how to fix this.
It can be tricky, and I'm picking my words here because obviously I'm really glad that you let me come and speak to you. I'm really pleased, especially when I see who you're speaking to next week. That's an incredible show that you've got lined up next week. Two people who I've followed for a long time in this industry. But so obviously there's a vendor behind me that's here saying, well, we'll do that for you, and they do fantastic job. For people who are just looking at, well, how do we do this ourselves? There's a lot of moving parts there. So you've got you need to know your estate and everything in your estate. And that is sometimes easier said than done. But you need to be aware of what things do we have, especially in cloud resources that are ephemeral and things are changing. What things are connected to an external network? What things host data that we consider to be critical? How do we link to databases? Do we have SSH keys? That kind of thing. It's doable especially if you've got a smaller environment or a static environment. So know what's there. And then when you're looking at any of the patches that need to be applied and what vulnerabilities are there, you'll have some context to understand what's important and to say, okay, yeah, we've got 10 machines, all of them have this major critical alert on them or vulnerability. But actually, we know from analyzing our estate that these are the ones that need to be looked at. And really, when you look at these, there are a number of different things in the industry that they're trying to, the CVSS score, that there are a number of different scoring mechanisms that are used. It can be quite difficult to build that all into context. Again, vendor over here, my shoulder, saying that we'll help with that. But if you understand your estate and being able to then try and tie together, does that critical impact this that would lead to something else? So it's all about knowledge of your estate and applying that. It's not an easy.
So, all right. So it seems like you need to have that view kind of mapped in somewhere so that that context doesn't really come for free. It sounds like some of it at least.
Yeah, and it's simply because we've got if we've got things that are changing a lot. So I go back to when I started cutting my teeth in IT as a young man. We would regularly have walkarounds of our data centers. And we would regularly go around and make sure that we pointed at each machine and we checked its asset label and we knew what each machine was doing. And people don't believe me that was the case, but we did. We went around each of our data centers to double check everything that was in there, and so that we knew what was going on. We would then also regularly scan the network to see if there are any new devices that appeared on that network, so that we could tell what was there and what was important and what we needed to manage. Now, when you suddenly scale that up to even when virtualization came in, you're then going, I need the hypervisor to tell me what VMs are there so that I can marry this all up. And then when you go into cloud computing and even cloud native ways of working, so with containers, serverless functions, things where we have much smaller units of compute, but perhaps a lot more of them, it's very difficult to then go around and say, I know this one, I know this one, I know this one. So if I were running something and I didn't want to go to one of the big security vendors like ourselves, then I would say, okay, I need to make sure that everything that goes into my environment has to be done as infrastructure as code, so that I've got everything enumerated. I've got that full CMDB of everything that could be there, and I've got a way of analyzing that programmatically without having to do that walk around of my virtual data center in the cloud to go, what's that VM do? What does this container do?
Okay. Yeah. I think I'm seeing now how, okay, this is part of needing to have more of that, not going to say maybe not declarative, but like sort of view, like bringing in infrastructure as code, right? As like how do we describe what we have in a way that is not going to be out of date, because that's really important real-time information to have if there's a security vulnerability. So we have to be able to describe what we have somehow, and refer to that. And from there, we can then build a lot more context. So that's, that means one thing in the cloud native world, and it means a different thing in the virtualized world. And it definitely means something different in, kind of a heritage world,
Yeah. Well,
for lack of a
it,
better
it
word.
it's still coming back to, I suppose, that walk around the data center. So it's still that comparing what we think we've got with what we've actually got there. So the way that we do it as Orca Security, and it's something that you could, if you were talking about how someone could do this themselves, the way we do it is we look at everything that's possibly running in a cloud environment. So by enumerating everything that's there, comparing that and to what it should look like, making sure that the misconfigurations, so all of the nice Gartner terms that come out of that, but looking at all those misconfigurations, looking at all those vulnerabilities, doing all those scans of all the different compute and different workloads, and then also doing that when it comes to infrastructure as code, and then being able to tally up between the two and say, this has been introduced into production, and we can trace that back to here's where the person introduced it. Not again from a blame point of view, but because we are always obsessed with how can we fix this in the easiest possible way, and that means tying that right back to how it got there. And if there isn't a way of tying back to where they got there, then we need to be sending that alert to PagerDuty, who's able to say, oh, this is where that alert goes to, or these are the people we wake up, or this is the workflow that's going to be initiated. Or we do it through sending it to our automation to say, oh, we know that if it's this cloud account, if it's in Azure versus AWS, then it goes to this team, or how to get that information to the right place. Because so often our threat research, and there's information on the internet as well that supports it, but our threat research team have shown that there's a lot of these alerts that are going to security teams who just can't action them. One, they're not the people who action them, and two, they're flooded with these alerts that are coming through. So how do we make, coming back to that right at the beginning, right? How do we make this so that it's everyone's responsibility, security? But that's like, it's like saying that world peace is everyone's responsibility. Well, yeah, but how do I achieve that? Well, here's how you can achieve that in your organization.
Yeah, I think that's a great sort of data point from your your threat team, right? That's just like, so much of this like can't be actioned. It's gotta that might be the first point of, hey, let's verify and validate this is a real thing. But the real next step is, now we have to get people involved. We have to get the right people involved, and we have to help them be able to do something about it. And so I think that's something that I've noticed has been coming up for me whenever I'd get questions about, okay, but what about PagerDuty for security teams? And it's like, yeah, absolutely. It's probably one of the sort of fastest growing groups that's using it. And I think like I understand better why, because of listening to you, because it's about that. It's not just about the security team being able to mobilize themselves. It's about the security team obviously finding out quickly, but then being able to mobilize their teammates in an efficient way, so that at the end of the day, it's maybe not the service is down, restore the service. It's more just like, hey, we need to remediate this vulnerability quickly. So that just connected a lot of dots for me. Sorry.
Well, the good thing is you'll see it across all. You'll see it the same as we do. So there'll be people who watch your show regularly who go, well, that wouldn't apply to us because we are this size or this type of industry, or we do this way of working. In reality, the reason why we have these things is that whether you are a DevOps shop through and through, where all alerts go back into our way of managing those, and we decide as a team whether it's what the priority is, and we weigh up the risk and all this kind of thing, or whether you're a traditional operations shop, which is my background, of well, we just care about the servers or we just care about that rather than the individual business services. The important point here is that we can only be able to provide the level of security that we all need if the right people are making the right decisions. And if you are in an enterprise, that probably means one of each of all of the above, where you've got certain business units who are operating a certain way and others who operate in a different way. And more, I'm actually seeing things where people are shifting between those ways of working, where perhaps they've had a service that they've been developing in an agile fashion and managing in that way, and this is how they deal with incidents. And then they're going, well, actually, we're going to do any more with that service. It's now just an operational service, which always seems a bit crazy, but that's an operational service now. So how do we have security alert the ops teams to patch the right thing? So it's very much about communication and getting the right people doing the right thing, and that is something that's going to change. It's not a we're done. You and I wouldn't sit down and draw it out for an organization and say job done. Let's go and get a whiskey or a cup of coffee. Instead, it's an ongoing process that needs to be revisited constantly.
Okay. Well, awesome. I wanted to kind of bring back one other point that we had talked about, and it's around, just a lot of the talk around staff and skills shortages, particularly related to security, and how does that have an effect on like how teams need to be thinking about how they approach and really get scale out of the size security teams that they do have? Because I don't know if you have some kind of different answer, but everywhere I hear it seems to be like we're not going to fix that skills gap anytime soon. Like it's there, so you have to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, so I was fortunate enough to be group CTO for a multinational organization, a €4.5 billion organization, and so operating at different time zones with different staff and different locales with different skill sets, and trying to see how do we keep on growing and meet the levels of growth that we want to as an organization. And so a bit pithy, but I try and think about things as that technology should automate processes and enable people. That's for me, that's what it's about. So the only way I think that we can cope with with managing changing people, and I don't mean even a skills gap, or sometimes I think that maybe we should be more loving of our teams. I always want to say our resources, but even that in itself is like branding people as just numbers. We want to be more caring for them. We want to do all these things, but even if it's not a skills gap, even if it's changing because of global things that happen, whether that's a pandemic, whether that's conflict, whether it's whatever we can do to help our people, for me, that means saying, okay, well, technology, we need to look at technology more and automate what we can where we can. Now, a big buzzword, of course, in the industry at the moment is AI, and that's all well and good. And I'm sure that at one point there'll be an AI version of me talking to you one day in the future. But for now, AI to me should be as a supporter. AI should be something that says, okay, so Ashley over here, he's really good with AWS, but he's rubbish with Azure. So how can he ask something that knows about the different technologies in Azure and can translate that for him? So how can I say, how can I check what S3 buckets are public in Azure, please, Mr. Computer or Ms. Computer? Well, I don't know that, from what I've just said there, you'd go, well, there's no S3 buckets in Azure because S3 is something in AWS, you crazy fool. But that's where maybe we can have some technology to support our people to say, yeah, okay, Ashley's not amazing at Azure today, but he knows his stuff. Well, we're obviously a different Ashley at this point in time, but he knows his stuff. So how can we enable him to operate at a higher level than he necessarily is? And I think that's what we want to be looking at for our team. So yes, we keep doing all the stuff we do, but how can we take perhaps a more junior resource or an on-premises security person and have them operate in the cloud? They're still smart people. So how can we enable them to operate at a higher level? So I would say explore technology as not as a tool for them to use, but as a tool to help processing people.
Yeah. There's still a lot of trust to be built, and fostered with the different kind of AI technologies out there. And for something as critical as like, okay, we've got to remediate a security situation, there's a lot of technical depth where you can get help, but keeping a human in the loop as someone who's bringing part of that expertise seems pretty useful. Well, uh, I think we've solidly made that connection with whiskey, and how to navigate the complex and technically uh, rich area of whiskey and security. Um, so I want to thank you for joining us today, and sort of sharing a lot of great perspectives. Just a reminder, folks, we'll be back next week with Charity Majors and James Governor. And look out for the podcasts on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I keep forgetting. Do they just call it Apple Podcasts? I guess they do. And you
I
can
like
see
the
the
way
show
you
notes
said.
from the so, you can start to read the show notes. I am getting some help from ChatGPT on how to write those summaries, which is a lot of fun, and hopefully useful for folks as you're catching up on different episodes. So thank you so much and have an uneventful day.
Thank you.